Hello class, this is part 3 of lecture 3. Um, One thing I want to say is that this last portion here is a pretty critical topic. This is going to cover mostly the article reading Shivani 2002. Shivani 2002 is a fairly outdated article at this time. Some of the terminology is a little different than what we typically use in a class like this. However, this particular paper covers a lot of the most critical concepts in a diagnostic perspective when it comes to somebody who we are trying to determine whether or not they have a co-occurring mental health and substance use disorder or medical disorder for that matter, right? Because we could see all three of these things intermixing. So this section of the lecture is really where the rubber meets the road when we're thinking about the most pertinent topics clinically for somebody who may be experiencing co-occurring disorders. Some ground rules to point out here, some points that are mentioned in Shivani and also critical points overall, is first distinguishing between a symptom and a sign. Both of these can be diagnostically important events, right? We use both of these symptoms and signs to understand the nature of a disorder. A symptom is something that happens internally in someone, either emotionally or mentally. I think one of the best examples we can use is some of these thought patterns versus their speech, right? Like I say all the time, we estimate someone's thought patterns through their speech, through what they say to us. So speech is a sign, right? Speech is an external behavior that an outsider can observe. So that's the primary difference between a sign and a symptom. Speech would be a sign where mental events, emotions, and thoughts are symptoms. Sign is an observable phenomena that indicates specific internal symptoms. And signs can also represent by themselves, very critical aspects of other disorders, particularly more often medical disorders. Are you going to see more serious signs? Where most of the time in psychology and mental health, we're going to be most concerned with signs pointing to internal mental events and emotional events. A syndrome is a pattern of symptoms and signs that coalesce in a predictable pattern over a discrete period of time. So basically, this is a cluster of symptoms, very similar to how we categorize a mental health disorder. However, there's a very small difference between a syndrome and a mental health disorder, and it really just has to do with the extent to which we believe the cluster of symptoms represents the full nature of somebody's condition. So a disorder would be the full condition, right? Where a syndrome could be a part of a larger disorder. That may make more sense as we look into this a bit more, but it's mostly just important to observe that sometimes a syndrome may not in itself represent a full disorder of some sort. It may be some kind of temporary experience somebody is having that in itself we wouldn't consider to be an independent disorder of some sort. Psychosocial, so this is also just down here in the bottom of this slide, is one important finding from Shivani 2002. Not necessarily a finding, because Shivani 2002 is more of a literature review. And one of the important things that I think everyone in the class should just keep in mind is that psychosocial stressors that result from, sorry I spelled that wrong, so from alcoholism can also contribute to long-term mental health difficulties. So this is just an important thing to keep in mind when we think about the mental health symptoms that somebody may be experiencing. Some of those mental health symptoms may be due to a independent mental health disorder. Others can be a direct result of the effects of a substance on one's mind and body. But another thing to keep in mind is that alcoholism and other substance use disorders can cause major difficulties in somebody's social environment, or financial difficulties, or physical health. And those effects of the substance use can also affect one's mental health condition too. So that's an important detail to keep in mind, just in terms of the overall complexity of considering the transactional nature of mental health symptoms and a substance use disorder. Another thing about, so this is just overall when it comes to Shivani, the purpose was to review the complexity of alcoholism co-occurring with various mental health disorders, kind of like I just mentioned a little bit there. 3 particular concepts are of most importance when it comes to this Shivani article. One is an alcohol-related symptom or sign. That's basically any kind of symptom. It may even look like well, they're all going to look like mental health symptoms, right? Anything that somebody reports can also be mental health. But an alcohol-related symptom is something that looks like a mental health symptom, but is actually being caused by intoxication, withdrawal, or some other effect of long-term use of a substance. An alcohol-induced syndrome, now really, like we said before, there really isn't a whole lot of distinction right now between an alcohol-induced syndrome and a mental health disorder. And the main reason that is because the DSM-5 now includes a very wide variety of substance-induced disorders, which means we no longer have to think about substance-induced symptoms as merely a syndrome, right? Because we were talking about before up here that syndromes aren't necessarily disorders. So that was true back when Shivani 2002 is written when it comes to things people experience when they're consuming substances, right? But in 2013, the DSM-5 came out. DSM-5 includes disorders that are substance-induced. Before the DSM-5, they just said, oh, well, if this is induced by a substance, then maybe we shouldn't even just call it a disorder. They changed their mind, and in the DSM-5, you can now consider alcohol-induced experiences. If they are, in fact, a syndrome, we can now diagnose that as its own mental health disorder, too. And of course, the last thing that is mentioned in Shivani is a co-occurring, independent psychiatric disorder that is occurring at the same time or even before the substance use disorder happened. Just another point from the Shivani article is that when he says psychiatric a lot. Shivani, I'm not sure if Shivani is male or female off the top of my head, but they mention psychiatric a lot rather than psychological or mental health. Psychiatric just refers to both medical or mental health conditions. So that's important to keep in mind too, right? Because we can say all these same things when it comes to medical disorders that could be overlapping with mental health disorders. So here's a couple other key points from Shivani. Primarily, they discuss the variety of different co-occurring disorders that can also occur with alcoholism. These will be most often the independent, separate mental health disorders, major depressive disorder being one of the top ones, bipolar being second most common, several anxiety disorders, specifically social phobia and panic disorder, are fairly common. Antisocial personality disorders in there too. PTSD, which I don't think was studied as deeply during this time as it is now, but we learned a lot more about PTSD and substance use disorder over the last decade or so. Most importantly to know is that PTSD is not as highly co-occurring with alcoholism itself, but much more so when it comes to more intense substance use disorders like amphetamine use disorders and opioid use disorders. We will see much higher rates of co-occurrence with PTSD. That being said, alcoholism also has some very high, or at least higher than average co-occurrence rates with alcoholism and PTSD. There's also some overlap between schizophrenia, but not to an extent as these other disorders. Alright, so here's the 4 main points that are also part of the Shivani article that we draw from when we are trying to distinguish between mental health symptoms that are related simply to the substance use, right, that are not in themselves a mental health disorder. How do we do that, right? How do we differentiate between substance use disorder and an independent mental health disorder? Well, one of the first things you want to ask is, did these mental health symptoms exist before the substance use disorder became habitual? The substance use itself became problematic, right? Somebody may have already began consuming a substance before the mental health illness showed, but what we want to see is which disorder came first. If we see these mental health symptoms, you know, when we talk to a client, this is what we obtain through their history report, right? So it's not an exact science usually, unless we can also get some, backup from a parental report of some sort. But basically, this is the first thing to ask. Did the mental health disorder happen first? If it did, that's going to greatly increase our chances of being able to say, it's likely these are two independent disorders. Because if something's truly substance-induced, well, you shouldn't see it until the substance use behavior becomes problematic. Now, you could still even argue this as well. You could theoretically argue that there is some sort of genetic, biological, physiological underlying condition that could cause both. Now, I'm getting a little bit deep, and don't worry about this. This is just a sudden thought that I had out of my own head just now, that it is possible that even before the substance use disorder becomes noticeable, those same causal biological markers inside you could be the same markers causing depression. But don't worry about that. Just for now, keep in mind, first point here, did the mental health symptoms come first? If so, this is probably an independent mental health disorder. Next, we have to ask, do the observed mental health symptoms correspond with the expected symptoms of intoxication or withdrawal from the substance? This is very important to ask if these mental health disorder or these mental health symptoms did not occur before the substance use disorder, right? So they say, oh, no, I haven't really felt depressed until I started drinking. Well, then we have to ask ourselves, okay, if this may not be an independent mental health disorder, could this be an effect of intoxication or withdrawal? And the only way we can really know that for sure is if the symptom they're consuming can cause those types of mental health symptoms. And I'll show you a little bit more about that later on, but that seems to make sense when you think about it, right? If the substance is causing this, then it should be an identified symptom that comes along with either intoxication or withdrawal from this substance. Third is, do the symptoms exist primarily when the individual is intoxicated, right, or using, or in active use, as we may say it? If the mental health symptoms are mostly only occurring when the person is actively using the substance that they're addicted to, then that's another sign that this is probably not an independent mental health disorder. Finally, do the symptoms mitigate? Do they lessen within 4 weeks after acute intoxication or withdrawal symptoms have ceased and abstinence is maintained, right? So if someone's quit using, this is probably one of the biggest ones, and they mentioned the 4-week thing in the Shivani article, is that if somebody can go 4 weeks of abstinence, then that's generally a good sign. If they're still experiencing those mental health symptoms, that's another sign that this person may have a co-occurring independent mental health disorder, right? So the two main things when you're deciding whether or not this is independent is, were the symptoms happening before the substance use became bad, and did they continue to happen after the substance use ended, right? So if the mental health symptoms are acting outside the bounds of just the substance use active addiction, then that's a sign this could be an independent mental health disorder. The two signs for whether or not whether this is just an effect of the substance use is, do the symptoms line up with what we'd expect from this particular substance, and do the symptoms tend to only happen when the person is in active use? So this all in all together are the best 4 points we have for trying to make a distinction. But keep in mind, remember, we also know things like that unofficial syndrome we talked about, PAWS, post-acute withdrawal syndrome. So that's an instance of a syndrome that can be related to the substance use, but may not actually be an independent mental health disorder. So that's an added level of complexity we sometimes have to consider here too. As we mentioned before in the prior lecture, though, that those symptoms more oftentimes look like depression. So that's when we really have to question that most. So here's just a list of all the different substance-induced disorders. These are all the different mental health disorders that can be considered induced by a substance, either by its intoxication or its chronic use. Psychotic disorders, bipolar disorders, depressive disorders, anxiety disorders, OCD, sleep disorders, sexual dysfunction, and neurocognitive disorders. So quite a lot, right? Quite a lot of the different categories of disorders can be induced by substance use or by substance use disorder. These are the disorders that do not have the substance-induced disorder option. So these ones have been decided that chronic or heavy substance use or a substance use disorder does not induce these particular disorders. So we have other neurodevelopment disorders like ADHD, trauma and stress-related disorders, dissociative disorders, somatic symptom disorders, feeding and eating disorders, elimination disorders, which is peeing and pooping in unusual locations, gender dysphoria, disruptive impulse control and conduct disorders, personality disorders, and paraphilic. So these would be always considered separate disorders from a substance use disorder. Maybe some reasoning for that. I think most of it comes down to the biological distinctions there. So just keep that in mind, that this is important to see what's actually possible to be induced by a substance use disorder. Finally, it's the most important to also consider the symptom clusters that are in the DSM when it comes to indicating intoxication or withdrawal. Some important things to keep in mind: intoxication requires recent ingestion or exposure to a particular substance. Withdrawal occurs several hours or days after cessation or when someone stops using a substance. Symptoms and duration vary considerably across or according to the substance. So there's a lot to keep in mind here, a lot to be familiar with. And let me just show you this slide very briefly. This is how I studied when I was doing my licensing exam, to try to understand all the various differences and comparisons between intoxication and withdrawal when it comes to all the different types of substance use. As you can see, there is a massive variety of different symptoms associated with intoxication over on this side of a substance and the withdrawal symptoms of a substance. So there's just hours of things that you can look at if you were to create a little information web of this sort for yourself. And I would strongly recommend you do that, especially for a course like this that's all about co-occurring disorders. For instance, we just see something I did right here: alcohol versus opioid intoxication. There are some similarities between these two conditions. For instance, both of them involve slurred speech. They both include impaired attention or memory. One thing that is different from alcohol use versus opioid intoxication is that opioid intoxication can involve drowsiness and coma. So this severely sedates someone. Now, you can have a coma occur with alcohol, which may also include stupor, but we don't see anything about drowsiness with alcohol. So that would be a very important distinction that you're able to make. Also, like we mentioned before, pupil constriction. That's an official symptom as well that's been listed for opioid intoxication. Now let's go over here for a minute. We see withdrawal symptoms, right? Pupil dilation. So rather than constriction, we see dilated pupil when somebody is in withdrawal. Muscle aches, rhinorrhea, which is the runny nose, lacrimation, which is teary eyes, piloerection, which is goosebumps, and dysphoric mood, nausea, and vomiting. These look very different than the intoxication symptoms to opioids. Now look at all this other stuff we've got here. We've got stimulants, cannabis, caffeine, hallucinogens, inhalants, sedatives. Well, there's only one type of substance that's not considered to have intoxication symptoms, which is tobacco, for some reason. Don't ask me. When we look over here at withdrawal symptoms, we see that there are two different substances that don't consider to have withdrawals. One is inhalants and one is hallucinogens. Like I mentioned a while ago, I think back in maybe I think it was lecture 1, we see that depressed mood is a symptom of withdrawal from tobacco. So very important to keep that in mind, right? If we're distinguishing between a mental health disorder and withdrawal, for instance, well, there's depressed mood right there, as well as insomnia and anxiety, difficulty concentrating. Both of these are symptoms that you would see also with depression or an anxiety disorder, which we'll talk about more later on. So this once again shows how complex this can all be when we're looking at something that is maybe induced by a substance use disorder, for instance, withdrawal from tobacco, or is it an independent depressive disorder? All that very critical to keep in mind. So let me move on. Oops, I think I need to click, there we go. All right, so here's the lecture response for today. What I want you to do, so this is just a little case study that I put together. Propose a diagnosis for George and support your diagnosis with at least 3 specific details from the description below. Let me just click out of this real quick here. So I want this to be no more than 300 words. Just keep this short, right? Don't need anything really large, but I just want you to show that that you're using the information from these slides to make a differential diagnosis. I'm just going to read this off and then close this lecture here. George is a 27-year-old married black male who is seeking services for a history of alcohol and cocaine use, as well as an unspecified mood disorder, which he's not really sure of. He can just tell you that. He has some sort of mood issues. He reports that he has been sober for at least 5 weeks since getting out of rehab and has been drinking 1 or 2 pints of liquor per night. He reports that he's been sober for at least the last 5 weeks since getting out of rehab and had been drinking 1 or 2 pints of liquor per night. So before then, right? He was drinking that much before he went in, but now he's 5 weeks sober. He's considering taking a medication because he has been having difficulties getting up in the morning. He reports having a very depressed mood, low appetite, no energy, sleep difficulties, and very low self-worth. He reports that these symptoms are especially bad in the morning and linger on through most of the day. He also reports having episodes of very strong interest in hobbies and activities, and that he will fixate on certain outlets. He reports that he used to stay up all night designing an expensive home aquarium for exotic fish, and worked on it persistently for about 3 to 5 days. He reports that he enjoys these episodes of heightened energy and activity, though he will feel very tired after 2 or 3 days and will eventually crash, though he can't say exactly how long it'll take. This is when his depressive symptoms tend to affect him most. He says that he wants to still have his high energy, but does not want to deal with the crashes anymore. Let me see, he puts wants to. Sorry for going in and out of this so much, but basically, think about the information you see here. Think about what may be missing. You can give me any 3 pieces of information, and you may say that you can't be sure exactly. Maybe you have 2 different ideas in your head. Whatever your answer, I'm not going to grade you wrong for your answer and whatever you diagnose George with. Just make sure that your 3 details that you include based on this are accurate, based on how we would diagnose somebody with a mood disorder or a substance use disorder or something else. That's all we need for this one. Once you've written up your brief response, turn it in for lecture 3 response. Thank you all. Have a good day.